Russia-Ukraine War Timeline. February 2022. On February 24, Putin launches what he describes as a special military operation, ordering tens of thousands of Russian troops into neighboring Ukraine from the north, east, and south. Hoping for a swift victory, Russian forces move on to the capital Kyiv but are eventually forced to retreat. Neighboring countries and the EU prepare to open their borders to hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the conflict. Queues at border crossings stretch for several kilometers, although men of conscription age are prevented from leaving the country. March 2022. At least 441 Ukrainian civilians are killed in the early days of the invasion. UN investigators subsequently say some of the killings, most notoriously in the Kyiv suburb of Bucha, may amount to war crimes. Russia is forced to scale back its war goals following stiff resistance from Ukrainian forces. April 2022. Dozens of people are killed in a missile strike on a train station in Kramatorsk. It was full of women, children, and elderly people trying to flee the fighting. Lacking the strength and courage to stand up to us on the battlefield, they are cynically destroying the civilian population, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says. Later in the month, Russia suffers a symbolic blow when the flagship of its Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, is sunk by what Ukraine claims to be its missiles. The number of people fleeing Ukraine passes the 5 million mark, according to the UN. Its refugee agency says the conflict has caused the largest refugee crisis in Europe this century. May 2022. Finland and Sweden formally applied to join NATO, in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is a historic moment which we must seize, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says at a ceremony at NATO headquarters with the Finnish and Swedish ambassadors. Russia captures the strategic Black Sea port city of Mariupol, following a 3-month siege. The Red Cross described as hell. June 2022. Russian missiles strike a crowded shopping mall in the city of Kremenchuk, killing at least 16 people. A UN spokesman condemns the attack as deplorable. July 2022. Russian forces capture the city of Lysychansk, completing the conquest of Luhansk province in eastern Ukraine. Russian energy giant Gazprom says it will have gas supplies to Europe through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Prior to the war, Europe imported more than 40% of its gas from Russia. Moscow and Kyiv agree a deal to reopen Ukraine's Black Sea ports, which had been blockaded by the Russian Navy. There are hopes that the breakthrough will ease the global food crisis. August 2022. Ukrainian forces launch a southern counteroffensive around Kherson, the only land gateway to Crimea. Russian supply lines, ammunition dumps, and an airbase in Crimea are targeted. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says the risk of nuclear confrontation had returned after decades. He calls the Russian shelling of the Zaporizhzhia facility in Ukraine suicidal. September 2022. European gas prices spiked by as much as 30% after Russia says one of its main gas supply pipelines to Europe will remain closed indefinitely. Gazprom had initially said the Nord Stream 1 pipeline had been closed for temporary maintenance work. Ukraine launches a counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region in the northeast. A key rail hub supplying the Russian front line is recaptured. Vladimir Putin orders the partial mobilization of hundreds of thousands of reservists. His decree sparks an exodus of military-age men trying to cross the border into neighboring countries. October 2022. An explosion badly damages the only bridge linking Russia to the Crimean Peninsula, which Moscow seized in 2014. Days later, Russia retaliates with the first missile strikes on Kyiv in months. In the following days, Ukrainian energy infrastructure is targeted in more waves of missile strikes. The country's energy minister says at least half of the country's thermal energy capacity has been hit. An additional 4 million children have been plunged into poverty because of the war. According to a UNICEF report, 2.8 million of them are Russian, the UN agency says. November 2022. Russia orders its forces to abandon Kherson, the only regional capital it had captured so far. The Kherson region was one of 4 that Putin had said would be part of Russia forever. After 8 months of brutal Russian occupation, the southern city of Kherson was liberated on November 12, prompting scenes of celebration by residents. December 2022. President Zelensky addresses the U.S. Congress during his first foreign visit since the war broke out. He says aid to Ukraine is an investment in democracy. On Christmas Day, Vladimir Putin says Russia is ready to negotiate over Ukraine. However, Kyiv says Moscow isn't serious about talks and says it will not rest until every Russian soldier is removed from its territory. January 2023. Reinforced by recruits, Russian forces make their first battlefield gains in months, capturing the salt mining town of Soledar in eastern Donetsk province. They also focus attention on the strategic town of Bakhmut, the key to the prized Donbass region. After weeks of geopolitical squabbling, a major moment arrived on January 25 when Germany announced it would provide Leopard 2 tanks to Kyiv and allow other European countries to export the German-made battle tank. At the same time, Biden said the U.S. would send 31 M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. February 2023. President Zelensky says Russian offensives in the east and south are part of a strategy to make gains before Kyiv receives tanks and other heavy weaponry from its allies. NATO also begins discussing its request for fighter jets and long-range missiles. Biden made a highly symbolic surprise visit to Kyiv on February 20th, his first since Russia's full-scale invasion. Standing alongside Zelensky, the U.S. president recalled how the pair spoke by phone as Russian forces rolled in. 1 year later, Kyiv stands. And Ukraine stands. Democracy stands, Biden declared. The Americans stand with you and the world stands with you. Zelensky said Biden's visit brought Ukraine closer to victory.